So we're going to talk about the myths about homesteading, and I'm not going to take long because it's cold out here, and I want to do it out here in the midst of God's nature as I do this this video with you here today. I want to talk about the 9 different myths that people talk about, and I think you'll get a lot out of it if you take note. First of all, number 1 is homesteading the same thing as prepping. That's a myth. That is a total myth. You can be a homesteader without being a prepper, and you can be a prepper without being a homesteader, but yet you can be both. Did you know that before we had what we call an industrialized grocery shopping like we have today, everyone basically depended on what I would call putting food away, canning food, smoking their food, as far as smoking their meats, preparing their meats in such a way so that they preserved them, whether it be with salt or sugar-cured hams, meats that were turned into jerky. We didn't use a lot of what we call refrigeration until the early 1950s. Until the early 1950s, people depended highly on their smokehouses and what have you. But the typical farmer was an automatic prepper. It wasn't that they were focused on how many guns that they could bury in a bunker somewhere and be ready in case there was the end of the world happening tomorrow. That wasn't the case. And if you're into that, I'm not here to criticize you or to even talk about that. That's not the subject today. But homesteading and prepping are 2 different things. My mouth is frozen, so I'm having a hard time talking. Number 2, homesteading is isolation from society. Many have jobs, careers, etc. Of course, they're not necessarily isolating themselves. You don't have to be an isolated person to be a homesteader. I call my farm a homestead. I could call it a farm. Both terms will be accurate in today's terms, and I'll explain that in just a moment. And but living in isolation, no. You could be a homesteader and live in the suburbs. You could be a homesteader and live in the city and have your backyard garden and call yourself a homesteader today if you wanted to do that. Number 3, homesteading is off-grid living. That is the biggest myth I've heard anywhere. I know that there's a lot of homesteaders that are into off-grid living, and I respect that. I am not off-grid. I have electric lines going down my farm roads here that bring electricity to the farm, and if I so choose, which I plan on doing, that is to do some things here off-grid, meaning that they're not getting their electricity from the electrical company. They're going to get it from certain things here is going to get its electricity from either hydro or wind or solar in the near future, and I look forward to that. Off-grid living doesn't mean that you have to be 100% off-grid. I've seen some criticism toward Doug and Stacy's channel with off-grid with Doug and Stacy for saying that they're off-grid when some people are saying that they're not, that that's a separate location from where they live. They may be putting on an act. I'm not sure about that. I'm not friends with Doug and Stacy, but I can tell you that you do not have to be 100% off-grid even if you are off-grid, and it does not determine whether or not you are a homestead or not. Off-grid is off-grid. Homesteading is just homesteading. Now, and I'm getting to a point here. Now, number 4, homesteading rejects all modern conveniences. Well, that is a big myth, huge myth. Modern conveniences have nothing to do with whether you're a homesteader or not. You can be a homesteader and be totally traditional, very authentic to the old practices, where they did it back in the early 1900s, back in the 1800s, or even the 1700s, and you could be a homesteader. You can actually have the most modern conveniences there are and still be a homesteader. So that has nothing to do with being a homesteader, whether you have modern conveniences or not. You do not have to be like a pioneer to be a homesteader. However, don't forget that word pioneer. Number 5, homesteading is a new concept. In other words, should it be neo-homesteading? Maybe. Now that's a good point. Still a myth. Homesteading is not a new thing. In fact, if you look at your history back in about 1862, there was a Homesteading Act that was developed here in the United States that allowed people right around the same time as when we call the Civil War took place, when the Civil War took place here in the United States, and also in 1866, directly following the Civil War, you had the Homesteading Act, the Southern Homesteading Act as well, which allowed people to claim government land as their own, and that was called homesteading. In other words, it was a claiming of land. You squatted on that land, or you claimed that land, you fenced in that land. That was done primarily and mostly in the Midwest, and but it was done in other states as well throughout the United States. And when the Southern Homestead Act amended the regular Homesteading Act of 1862 and amended it in 1866 for the Southern Homestead Act, that also opened up the door for millions of acres that were made available to also free blacks that used to be slaves or came from slavery. They were given the opportunity to own land here in the United States as well through the Homesteading Act, the Southern Homesteading Act. And not everyone could participate in that, but I will say this, that out of all the farmers that were what they called black farmers at that time, or African American if you want to call it that, they didn't use the term African American at the time, but 25% or so of the farmers that were black Americans, they owned their own farms. 25% of the farmers that were black owned their own farms during that time. Amazing statistic, very amazing statistic, absolutely. So it's not a new concept, the word homesteading. Homesteading goes way back, and we'll talk about that in just a minute. Homesteading, number six, the myth. Number 6, homesteaders are modern tree huggers. Wow. Tree hugging, flower children, and hippies, what have you. No, that does not define homesteading. Is it possible to be a tree hugger and a flower child hippie person and be a homesteader? Absolutely. If that's what you want to be, you can be a homesteader even if you do embrace that mindset. It's totally fine. Nothing wrong with that, but it does not define a homesteader. Homesteading, number 7, is limited to small remote properties. No actual size determines it, by the way. Some people think that homesteading only applies to small acreage. Homesteading to some people says that if you get above a certain amount of acres in your farm, you can no longer call it a homestead. You must call it a farm, and it only applies to smaller acreage. Now that's a debate among some people, but yet there's really no clear definition of it. No one governs what you call or what you don't call a homestead. I have 56 acres here. I call it a homestead. Why? Because to me, the word homestead has a family feel to it. It just has a good feel to it. I grew up on a farm. We didn't call it a homestead, but this one here that I have, I call it a homestead just because it has a good feeling to the wording homestead. So, wow. Number 8, homesteaders are weird, crazy, and are rejects and misfits of society. Wow. Now that is a good one. It is a myth, by the way, that does not determine whether or not you're a homesteader or not. You don't have to be weird, crazy, and be a reject and a misfit of society. In fact, you would not believe how many people are selling their multi-million-dollar homes, buying a tract of property that they can farm and grow their own food, be self-sustenance within their system, and actually moving into a camper out of the multi-million-dollar homes. It's happening over and over and over. You don't have to live in a camper, by the way, to be a homesteader either. But so many people are moving onto a farm setting, a homestead setting, so that they can grow their own food, survive on their own recognizance, be able to provide their family with all the needs that they possibly can, and they enjoy the fact that they can grocery shop from their backyard and not the grocery store, because they know what they're getting, they know what they're buying, they know what they're investing into their health, because they're either growing it themselves or they're buying it from one of the neighbors around the area. Number nine, last but not least, Homesteaders don't believe in medical science. That is not true. That does not create the definition of a homesteader. Someone who homesteads, it's not that they reject everything that's modern, reject science, reject medical help, rejects doctors and nurses and medications. That's not the case. However, you will see that people who do have farms that live close to nature learn over time to depend more on natural remedies. That does happen as a norm, but it does not define homesteading. Now, I'm going to give you a quick history background on the misconceptions here that are myths. It's basically what it is, just misconceptions. If you truly want to understand homesteading is a term, it's a word, and it doesn't really go beyond that. It is a word. It's a definition of how you decide to define it. It's not a definition as necessarily how that one or two individuals or anyone's opinion defines it. Homesteading is determined by the way that you define the word and how you use it, because it's with a wide brush stroke of usages and the way that it applies to the way that people use that word or the words homestead, homesteading, homesteaders in their vocabulary. If you were to go to Europe and you were to talk about where the pastor of a church lives, that is called a homestead in parts of Europe. Did you know that? In some places in the world, if there is what we call a holler here in the North Georgia and western North Carolina mountains, all the way up through the Appalachian Mountains and the Blue Ridge Mountains and the Smoky Mountains, a holler is an area of what we call a gap, and it has a flat area up the gap where people can put homes that kind of spreads out a little wide, flatter area that doesn't get flooded with the streams going down the gap. People build their homes up that gap. That's called a holler. In some countries, that's called a homestead. A homestead also could be where not just a home and the outbuildings like the barn and what have you, but it could also include other family members' homes as well. Some of you may call that a family compound. And so there's different terminologies, different definitions that could be utilized in regards to homestead. Narrowing that down, the word homestead basically means you have a farmhouse, and you may even call your house the farmhouse, and you have other buildings or other things going on around you as well, whether it be a garden or you're raising animals. You may have a chicken house, you may have a barn, you may have hogs, you may have some cattle, you may have a milk cow, you may have rabbits, you may have chickens. Most people, when they get started in what we call the neo homesteading that's going on right now, and a lot of people got into homesteading during the COVID season, and then after COVID, people were staying at home more, and they wanted to stay home. They didn't want to go back to work, and they started growing their own food and started getting more actively involved in growing their own things. Neo homesteading definitely is, I believe, going to be a term that's going to be utilized and used more when people describe the modern day homesteading, because it's much beyond like someone like me that has an actual farm. Neo homesteading is going to apply to people that grow food literally on their back deck in towers. You know, you've seen those where they have the growing towers to where they can grow food on their back deck. Homesteading is a way of life today. Neo homesteading is. So we're going to be hearing more about the word neo homesteading. Anyway, it's been a little while since I have done a video here on YouTube, at least a week. Reason so has been very busy. I've also been working on some research and putting some things together in regards to a very deep educational series on what homesteading is all about and the history of homesteading. You've heard me mention just tidbits, little bitty hints of some of the things that came up even in our talk today. But I hope you got something out of this video. I hope you subscribe. Help us build this channel. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Told you it's going to be a quick video. It's cold outside. I got to play with the dog before it gets dark. Got to throw the frisbee to him and let him fetch a little bit and have a good time before it gets too dark to do much here on the farm. God bless you here from Welch Family Homestead This is Jeff Welch signing off. God bless.